Massive update for XRP investors. Japan just ended 30 years of free money, and today we break down how this is set to impact XRP. And during today's episode, we're going to show our listeners the highlights of the Kamilah Stevenson podcast, where she breaks down how 30 years of free money just ended in Japan. As for over 3 decades, free money was being lended out of the Japanese economy and invested into global assets all around the world. Europe, China, the United States, all major economies were impacted greatly during this time, leading to a rapid appreciation and inflation of many different assets. Now, where this directly impacts Ripple is Ripple's strong ties with SBI Holdings to enable real-time XRP remittances inside of Japan. This is going to expand to all major global corridors, accessing liquidity in a way that we've never seen before. With Japan officially raising rates, the Bank of Japan pushed rates higher toward cheaper, faster solutions like XRP's on-demand liquidity. As capital is recalled from all these different global economies and back into the Japanese country, we could see XRP tapped as the liquidity solution, eventually benefiting many of its investors. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Good Evening Crypto, your favorite crypto news related channel. If you enjoy this content, smash that like button and subscribe, as you're going to get an update every single day, 5:30 p.m. Eastern time. And we're going to start off this episode highlighting how 30 years of free lending just ended in Japan. And we're going to start by breaking down the fundamentals here and then expanding into how this is set to impact XRP. Let's play this clip and we'll break it down.
Here's specifically what's happening now so you can have a clear understanding. Japan's interest rates are rising. And when rates rise, Japanese bonds become more attractive. And when Japanese bonds become more attractive, institutions no longer want to keep their money tied in U.S. assets. So what do? They start selling. And I don't mean selling a little bit. I mean massive forced selling of the U.S. stocks, the bonds, the techs, the markets, all of it, the crypto, Bitcoin, whatever. Why?
And we began to see this, Johnny, as the 25 basis points were priced in over the past several months, with digital assets like Bitcoin going from $126,000 to all the way down to $80,000. Even an asset like XRP, which went from $3.65 this summer to less than $1.80 in value today. This is all part of that major unwind and the Fed pricing in that downward spiral that she's talking about. But let's continue.
Because they borrowed yen decades ago. They converted it to dollars, invested those dollars in global assets, and now the yen is getting stronger and Japanese yields are rising. Those investors have to unwind the trade. They have to return the yen that they borrowed. And the only way to do that is to sell the foreign assets that they bought and convert the cash back to yen. That process right there is the reverse carry trade, and it causes sudden liquidity shocks, big market dips, increased volatility, selling pressure hitting assets that did nothing wrong, and forced liquidations in risk markets. This is why you may see some markets starting to shake even when the U.S. economy looks fine. It's not about fear and it's not about the charts. It's not about the FUD. But instead, it's macro mechanics. Markets don't fall because people are emotional. They fall because liquidity gets pulled out of the system by macro forces that most people don't even understand. And so here's the key part. Bitcoin could get hit hard because it's one of the most liquid assets in the world. If institutions need to free up cash quickly, they sell Bitcoin first, not because Bitcoin is bad, but because Bitcoin is easy to sell instantly. And this is where the opportunity for XRP starts to open. And I just want to tell you, I have both XRP and Bitcoin. And if any of them were to fall, I'm just going to load up some more. But with that being said, I want to talk about why XRP is uniquely positioned in a liquidity crisis. This is why Japan, of all countries, is the most important indicator, because Japan is the epicenter of FX flows. Japan has already tested Ripple technology. Japan is open to digital settlement, and Japan is entering a 30-year financial transition.
So if you guys believe that Japan is going to tap the XRP ledger as a liquidity solution, smash that like button. And if you disagree, leave a comment underneath the video. But one thing is very clear. Japan has already integrated the XRP ledger technology with the SBI Holdings, which is the largest bank in Japan today. With that liquidity corridor being turned on, we could see the floodgates open for liquidity on top of the XRP ledger. Now, everybody knows about the repricing narrative, which we're going to get into at the end of this episode. But if the Federal Bank of Japan decides to tap XRP as the liquidity solution, they could then take control of that asset and reprice it according to the amount of liquidity that's going to be driven on that network. If you enjoy this content, smash that like button, leave some thoughts below, but let's continue here.
When a system this big starts changing, the tools it chooses to fix those problems can get revalued overnight. So this utility-driven demand could create realistic high numbers of XRP, okay? So how does realistically XRP reach triple digits? Again, I'm not telling you what XRP is going to reach. I'm just sharing with you the information so that you can see the things that could come into place that could probably allow XRP right now to become more valuable. So I'm just showing you what would actually have to happen for this kind of revaluation. I'm not sharing this because I feel bullish or anything. I actually have lower expectations, but hey, I'm okay with any opportunity that goes above my expectations.
And this has kind of been my take with the entire Jake Claver analysis, is that I am rooting for Jake to be correct, but my 7 years in this market have told me this is a long-term game that we're all playing here, and nobody gets rich overnight. Now, when you think about what's happening and what we're going to break down throughout this episode is the circumstances in which the Bank of Japan taps the XRP ledger as a global liquidity solution. And there's two major advantages. One, it's the most liquid asset on the planet. That's a simple, very easy to understand narrative. The second one is that it frees up half the global banking liquidity today. It would mean going forward, the Bank of Japan would only have to keep money in one account instead of two. And that means if you're sending $1 million from Japan to New York, there's $1 million in Japan, there's $1 million in New York. Well, leveraging the XRP ledger, you only need that $1 million in the receiving end. And that's the major advantage that the XRP ledger provides here. And the reason that the Bank of Japan would tap it, it's not to just appreciate the value of the asset, it's because they need it to solve the next global crisis.
So it has nothing to do with my personal opinions at all. Nothing I say is financial advice. I'm sharing for educational purposes only. Do your own diligence. But I'm talking about the fact that it's math, it's liquidity, and it's utility adoption. So let me break that down clearly. When an asset is used for real settlement, especially cross-border, the demand comes from institutions, not retail. That's why I'm saying I can't make this price go up. You're not going to make this price go up. It's the institutions and the demand that would make this price go up. And institutions don't buy $50 of XRP. They don't always dollar cost average. They don't flip short term. They buy in millions, tens of millions, and sometimes billions. And I know because I'm watching the whales load up. And they hold because they need liquidity daily, hourly, or even by the second. So here's how the price mechanics work in a utility-driven model. And I do want to note that I gave this same hypothetical situation to AI, and they said the same thing. And so, again, it's not about the price point. It's just about if all of these things explode at the same time, almost like a big catastrophe all at once. This is how we get to a high XRP price. Number one, supply becomes locked up. So when banks or institutions use XRP for settlement, those units are not flipping around on exchanges. They sit in custodial accounts, liquidity pools, corridor wallets, private infrastructure. XRP's liquid supply starts to shrink, and this dries up the available amount on the open market. So when supply shrinks, price rises by mathematical reality.
Supply shock.
Number two, institutional demand is sticky. This is the major difference from hype cycles where retail buys, retail sells, okay? But institutions, they're not buying XRP because they believe in it. They buy it because they need it. They need it to move money. They need it to settle transactions. They need it to manage liquidity. They need it to reduce FX costs. They need it to speed up cross-border flows. This demand is permanent, not emotional. Sticky demand plus low supply equals structural revaluation. Number three, liquidity corridors multiply the effect. If Japan opens corridors using XRP even lightly, you're going to get constant buy pressure, deeper liquidity pools, market depth increasing, big players entering quietly, stabilizing price floors, and upward pressure from settlement demand.
And this really speaks to the first mover advantage that we always highlighted. We applied this to the ETF, Johnny, and you saw that with Canary Capital. A very small company, only $200 million in assets under management. For comparison, Franklin Templeton has $1.5 trillion. Well, their XRP ETF actually has more assets under management than any other product that exists today because they were the first to the market. Same idea applies to Japan tapping the XRP ledger here, where the moment that one Japanese bank starts using the XRP ledger ODL corridor, every other bank is at a disadvantage, not just in Japan, but globally. And I think she does a phenomenal job highlighting that. If you're enjoying this content, guys, smash that like button. We're going to play one more clip here, and then we'll break it down.
$7 range with light usage. This is how you could get to a $10 to $30 range with corridor adoption. This is how you can get to $50 to $100 with major settlement integration, and then 200 plus in extreme liquidity crisis. All right. And that's what we could be dealing with if Japan chooses XRP. It's not magic. It is liquidity mathematics. If XRP becomes part of Japan's FX plumbing or any major liquidity system, the price must rise to handle the volume. Utility forces valuation. Okay. And this is because of the needs, the usage, and the flow. Now, I want to go even deeper, because when I talk about possible triple digit XRP, I'm not saying it because it sounds good or because I'm trying to make you believe it. I'm really not. I'm just saying it because when you look at the math and when you understand liquidity flows, FX value, cross-border settlement, and institutional demand, you start to see very clear, realistic price tiers. If then situation. Let me say that. Now let's walk through them one by one so you understand. And again, I did test it with AI. And so
Johnny, before we get into these, I'd love to get your take on this, because here's the billion, trillion, maybe even multiple $1 trillion question in the room. Does the Bank of Japan tap XRP Ledger as a solution to a global liquidity crisis? If they do, the floodgates have opened. These reevaluations are up and open for business. If not, we have to operate under a totally different understanding here. But I'd love for you to rely on some of your prior experience. What does all this mean to you?
Well, so really, when you take a deeper dive into this and the whole Jake's theory of how we get there, it all comes down to one thing: a liquidity crunch crisis, meaning all of a sudden the world starts going crappy. Things are failing, like an unwind trail, kind of like we had in 2008, where we had the credit crisis, and there wasn't a lot of money there to cover margin calls. So what happened? This whole thing is literally driven by the concept or idea that margin calls are coming, as she rightfully stated, right? As the yen trade unwinds, people need money. You get a call from your bank. The minute rates go up, like 0.25%, banks start calling their clients going, okay, I need some money back. And by the way, you got 4 hours. You got 4 hours to get it back to me, right? Well, here's the problem. With our current plumbing of today's system, when you go to sell a stock or any asset for that matter, it takes about 1 to 2 days for that to settle. So if I've got to pay you back in 4 hours, Abs, and I go and sell something to pay you, but I don't get the money for 2 days, how the frick am I going to pay you? So I want people to understand this is exactly the problem that Jake is trying to say and what she's trying to describe, where XRP can come in and solve the problem. And let me explain how that works. So I go and I sell my stock, but now I got to wait 2 days. So I still have this problem that you're on the other line saying, I need my money in 4 hours, Johnny. Well, now you got 3.5 hours, by the way, Johnny. Okay, well, I've sold the stock. I don't have to, but here's the good news. When I sell the stock, my exchange gives me like a ghost credit. Now because it knows I'm getting that money, but I don't literally have it here right now. But now I get that ghost credit. It's sitting in my account here in New York. But here's the problem. I got to pay Japan. How do I pay Japan with a bunch of money that's sitting here in New York in US dollars when I have to give it to them in yen? And that is where XRP comes in, because now I can go with that money that I got credited. I buy XRP and I transfer it over. Right now I send it to my bank in Japan, and then they take that XRP and then they sell it and convert it to yen. And that is literally the credit crisis problem, if you will, or liquidity crisis, that if enough of this happens at the same time and banks start crashing and institutions are going to need solutions, XRP can solve the problem, Abs. And that's literally the whole premises of how Jake's thing works and what she's talking about there. And that's the kind of thing. Now, will that happen? Well, we saw yesterday that the credit, crisis or unwind was kind of mitigated. He came out and said, we're doing 0.25%. The market baked in 0.25%, and we didn't see a bunch of panic. We don't see the whole world crashing like we saw in August of 2024 when this was a surprise. So the question is this, to answer your question. He says we're going to go from 1% to 2.5% or 2.25%. He wants to raise. At some point along that raising, and I don't know when it's going to happen, but for those folks who haven't unwound yet, when the reality sets in and they need to do it, if that crisis is big enough where there's so much unwinding happening at the same time, Abs, That's where I would say we have the highest probability of seeing this XRP solution come into effect. When that occurs, well, we got to wait to see when the unwind happens.
And what we know for sure, Johnny, is that if the Bank of Japan decides to tap the XRP ledger as a liquidity solution, it's going to have a major impact on the XRP price. And we've gone as far to call it the XRP repricing that's in the process of occurring by banks today. But I want to give a massive thank you to Johnny. I thought that was a great explanation, guys. If you're enjoying this content, smash that like button. And now that we have a great understanding of what's happening in Japan and what needs to occur for XRP to rise in value, we're going to break down how much liquidity it would take to see specific price targets for this digital asset. Here it is.
Did talk about tier 1, which is light adoption, $3 to $7. This is where, let me explain it. Japan uses XRP lightly. Only a few corridors, test Ripple's rails, small scale liquidity support, minimal bottleneck reduction, or limited institutional demand. Nothing crazy, just basic utility. This alone could push XRP price from the 3 to 7 range consistently. This is the training wheels phase. And again, I'm going through these numbers. These have nothing to do right now with the charts. These are macro events, okay? Tier 2 is the medium corridor usage. That would be $10 to $30. Now you have maybe several corridors open, cross-border flows increasing, more institutions using XRP for intra-bank transfers, FX stress making fast liquidity more valuable, and settlement speeds saving banks real money. This is where the demand outpaces the liquid supply left on exchanges. $10 to $30 can become a natural floor. It's not hype. It's just what happens when real infrastructure starts using a finite asset. Tier 3 would be heavy settlement integration, maybe $50 to $100. This level could require Japan using XRP for major liquidity assistance, SBI level adoption, large FX corridors using XRP as a bridge, significant flows moving through Ripple rails, banks demanding XRP to reduce liquidity risk, and utility-driven structural revaluation. This is where XRP no longer trades like a crypto. It trades like critical financial infrastructure. So $50 to $100 can become a mathematically reasonable valuation for the liquidity role XRP would be playing. This isn't moon math, it's macro math. I'm gonna stress that. Now, here is tier 4. Let me be very clear here. I am not saying that this will happen. I'm saying this is the upper bound of what's possible if the global financial system experiences a liquidity crunch and Japan or other major corridors lean heavily on XRP's utility. I want to make that clear. This tier assumes a major liquidity shortage, global FX stress, institutions needing fast settlement tools, XRP being the only scalable option in certain corridors, and huge amounts of capital requiring rapid, cheap settlement. In that situation, XRP's price adjusts to handle the liquidity needs.
So what I think is really interesting here, Johnny, is that this gives us a clear understanding of how some people out there are getting to these ridiculously high price targets for XRP. There's not a lot of blockchains that you can apply this concept to. And because the XRP ledger and Team Ripple have integrated themselves in Japan for almost a decade now, there's a reasonable plausibility that it could legitimately be tapped as a liquidity solution. I was going through some other data prior to recording, and what I did learn about Japan is that almost all 5 major banks in Japan, not almost all 5 major banks in Japan have worked to integrate Ripple's XRPL ODL corridor, meaning the rails have been established, but the liquidity hasn't been turned on yet. And why would you be building highways if you don't plan for cars to drive on those roads? That's the exact analogy that I'm kind of looking at here, guys. But I'd love to hear, do you believe the Bank of Japan will tap XRP? Let us know underneath the video. Johnny, what's your reaction to the repricing that needs to occur?
Yeah, so absolutely, repricing is it's a lot. I spend a lot of time too digging in deeper as to how this would really work, the mechanics of it. You know me as the engineer, I'm like, wait a minute, it's not just going to go from 2 to 50. It can't work that way, right? It's not going to happen. But what can happen, or what would potentially happen in the situations where she described, and she described it well. It's all about liquidity crisis, liquidity crunches. When that happens, and we need large sums of money to have to move through the pipes or through the plumbing from New York to Japan or wherever it's going to service those markets, there has to be a value or price of it that's so high so that you're not eating up all the order books at $2. If you try to buy $100 billion or $1 trillion of XRP at $2, you can't, because there's just not enough coin in it, and you would just eat up all the order books, and the price would be all over the place. So what would happen is you would need something like a central banks would step in and say, okay, we're going to use this as an asset. This is going to be the bridge asset. And oh, by the way, we're going to value it at, boom, $50. Or we're going to say it needs to be, like she's saying, it needs to be repriced at $100 because it's going to service a market of this size. I'm making it up, $1 trillion or $2 trillion. If the service $2 trillion, it needs to be X. Or to service 500 quadrillion, it needs to be Y. That's how you're hearing all these prices, Abs, because people are hearing, oh, it could service this size market or that size market. And if it does, well, then yes, the price is going to have to be adjusted. No question. The key is who adjusts it. Well, first of all, you need the central banks to say, yes, we're going to use it. By the way, we know they were testing it with Project Agora a year ago, so that could still be in the works. And if they come and they do that, then the second thing you need, obviously, is the crisis. Now, I'm not so sure whether it's a crisis or not that's going to drive this, Abs. I think at the end of the day, you said something important. They ain't building a highway for no cars to drive on it. The highway is being built. At some point, they're going to turn this thing on and start using it. So for me, the real question comes down to what ultimately will be the size of the market that this bridge asset is going to service, because that's going to dictate what they reprice it to at some point in time when that does happen. But that's how it works, folks. It will require something like a central bank or the Bank of Japan stepping in and saying, this is the asset we're using and this is what it's worth. And boom, we could see that repricing happening potentially overnight. Now, again, and I think that's where people talk about the flip of the switch, Abs. But if it does, those are the steps that need to happen. And when we see that happening and the central bank stepping in and saying, yep, we're going to bless it, this is going to be the bridge asset tool, well, then you can almost expect that there'll be some kind of repricing coming.
Well, we've been focused a lot on the XRP price chart as well, guys. And in order for us to get a euphoric move, we're going to need major liquidity to enter the crypto space. But some good news for XRP investors is that the RSI is reaching historic lows. And you guys can see the last 3 times we had this indicator, we got some major moves on the XRP price chart. Now, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. And if you look at what happened back in 2017, when the RSI reached these levels and we got that once in a lifetime, quote unquote, breakout, if we copy and pasted something similar here, we could be looking at some exuberant price targets for XRP. But I encourage everybody, do your own research and dig into the fundamentals, because there's not a lot of blockchains that can compete with the XRP ledger. And with the Bank of Japan crisis upon us, we may witness this be tapped as a solution. If you enjoyed this content, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you all in the next one. So if you're looking to do the same strategies that we implement here on Good Evening Crypto, I would advise everybody sign up for Merlin and click on the ITrust Capital link below. Now, why did these two ideas play off one another? Merlin is going to allow our listeners to understand where they should be taking profit in this market, and ITrust is going to allow our listeners to take that profit tax-free through an IRA product. Now, that's not the best part about this. We are giving new clients a $100 sign-up bonus using the promo code GEC9. So I would encourage everybody, click on the link below the video, use promo code GEC9, and set yourself up for success during this crypto bull market.